Yeah, I want to introduce Joan Klagsbrun, and Joan, please just kind of take it away.
Okay, I'm a psychologist and psychotherapist and coordinator, and I fell in love with focusing in 1976 when I met Eugene Gendlin at Naropa Institute in Colorado, and the love continues. First of all, I'm delighted to be here, and what a wonderfully diverse group you are, and it's just a privilege to be speaking with you today. And the premise of my talk today is that the spiritual dimension is an essential component of being fully human. And it can't be relegated to religion or to some esoteric aspect of our life, because it's a quintessential component to living a full life. And this dimension has the power to heal, and the power to comfort, and the power to give meaning to our lives and those of our clients. So I don't know about you, but when I take a trip, I like to have an itinerary. So I'm going to give you a short itinerary for today's journey. So we're going to first talk about what spirituality is and what it means for each of us. Then we're going to talk about if focusing opens to the spiritual for you, and if so, how does it do that, right? And then we're going to look at other gateways or portals or doorways to the spiritual, because there's so many, and they're very personal. So we're going to explore each our own. And then I'll ask you to do some focusing and then writing on a couple of prompts that look at pivotal spiritual experiences in our lives. And you'll get to share that for a few minutes in breakout groups with 2 other people. When we come back, we'll turn to how we can bring spirituality into whatever work we do and to our relationships to deepen them. So I'd like to begin with a poem by Rumi, which you probably are familiar with. Today, like every other day, we wake up empty and frightened. Don't open the door to the study and begin reading. Take down the musical instrument. Let the beauty we love be what we do. There are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground. So even though Rumi wrote that in the 13th century, it seems like it's never been more relevant than today, right? We wouldn't say take down the book. We might say take down the book in the study, but more likely we'd say don't go right in the morning to your email and your Twitter and your Instagram or whatever, right? Stay with starting your day in a way that's expressive and creative and connected for you. When he says, let the beauty we love be what we do, for me, that means he's saying what we most love is what will bring us most alive. And almost always what we love is an invitation to the spiritual. So I think he's really guiding us to bring attention to that which is essential, to that which is nourishing, to that which enlivens us. You know, the author Suzuki Roshi, most of you know who that is. He wrote a book and he says, the most important thing to remember is the most important thing, right? We want to just not get so pulled by what feels like the things we have to take care of in our life that we miss what's most essential to our lives. So let's start to talk about what spirituality is. Now, the root word of it is spiritus in Latin. And in the book of Genesis in the Bible, it says the spirit of the breath, in Hebrew that's ruach, moves over the formless water and the void and brings forth life, right? So we're getting this message that spirituality is about aliveness. It's about life. Joseph Campbell, who wrote about the hero's journey, he said, people think that what we're seeking is meaning in life. He said, I don't think that's what we're seeking. I think we're seeking is the experience of being alive, that we actually can feel the rapture of being alive. So I think we'd all agree that the spiritual dimension takes us really to a timeless dimension. And sometimes we would describe it as we're filled with awe, or sometimes we're filled with gratitude, or we're filled with peace, or contentment, or harmony. But often we see that we're seamlessly joined into a larger interconnected field that's palpable for us. It's a felt sense, it's a felt meaning. It's not an intellectual one. So let's just take a moment now, and each of us take a pause, and you might want to close your eyes and say, ask yourself, what does spirituality mean to me? What is it for me today, in this moment? Of course, it will be different at different times. What comes to you when you ask yourself, what is spirituality? And then wait and let your body tell you what it knows. And when you're ready to share, just unmute yourself. And give us a nugget, a sentence, an image, what comes for you.
Connection with all.
Connection with all.
This is Francis. I'm reminded of a poem or a verse. A man's reach must exceed his grasp, else what to heaven for?
I love it. Lovely. Anyone else? No pressure to share, but if there's something that's come for you, we'd love to hear it.
I think of a connection, definitely. And it's a connection with non-physical reality as well, a transcendence.
Connection with non-physical reality, a transcendence, says it so well.
What came for me was relationship and creation and mystery.
Lovely.
I have a bit difficulties with the word, so I just put it away. And for me, it's the in-between.
The in-between, between here and there. Yeah. Great. One more?
For me, I can't find the exact word, but it has to do with meaning, being meaningful, coherence in the world, not meaninglessness, something around that.
Yes, coherence and meaningfulness. Yeah, very important. Well, we're seeing that it's a very inclusive term, and for some of us, it might not even be the right word. So I'm glad you, Stephanie, you said that. Sacred might be a better word for some people. But I think we'd all agree that it's being connected to something greater than yourself and something greater in yourself, right? That the me that's worried is a small me. The me that's in a moment of intense gratitude there's a lot more of me there, right? So it's both connected to something greater than oneself and something greater in oneself. And I think it's always about penetrating the surface of our lives. In the paper that some of you might have read, I defined it as a way of seeing the world that provides both unity and consolation. And there's something very consoling about feeling that connection and feeling that sense of coherence and meaning. So I want to talk to you a bit about a man named David Yaden, who is a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania on spirituality. And also he's moved into the area of psychedelics And if you are interested in that, you can go on YouTube. His last name is spelled Yaden, and there's lots of talks and interviews about psychedelics. But what he says about spirituality, he says that it is, spirituality is an altered state of consciousness where there's a perception of an unseen order of things. Let me say that again. He says it's an shift in consciousness where there's a perception that there's an unseen order of some kind. And how many of you have felt that you've had some spiritual experience in your life? Some time when you felt that connection to something greater? Okay, so I would say most of you, not all of you. And he did a survey of Americans to see how many people, based on his definition, felt that they had had a spiritual experience. And what would you guess? What percentage of people in the United States would say they have experienced a spiritual experience? Anyone want to take a guess?
80%.
Well, actually, it was only 35%.
Oh,
That we live in a culture and a society that's kind of has a poverty around the spiritual dimension. We're a very materialistic society, right? So, so it's very important that each of us who believe in the importance of that dimension bring it into our lives and into the lives of people with whom we work and whom we live. So after he found that 35%, he decided he wanted to see what categories they fit into, if there were patterns to what spiritual experiences people had had. And so he found there were 3 categories. And the first category, he said, were people who had an experience of either God or some experience of divinity, something they would call divine. Right? It might have been a light, it might have been a being. So that was the first group. The second group, he found, had a sense of unity. And he actually said there were people who had what he called extroverted unity, where they actually felt like the nature was alive and sparkling and the world was very alive. But there was also, he said, introverted unity, where people felt just a sense of harmony and a sense of peace and contentment inside. And then the third category surprised me, I'll say that. It was a connection with somebody who you loved, who had passed away. And whether you actually heard that person's voice or imagined seeing them or just felt a connection to him, that was the third category. And so I want to tell you a story about a focuser whose story really connects to that third category. And the story is about Joe Coletti. And is that a name that you know, any of you? So some of you do, Randy, and yeah, you do. So he was a businessman in his early middle age, and he lost his daughter in an automobile accident. And he said that he spent the first year in such a state of grief and so distraught that all he found himself doing all day long was saying, how can I live with so much grief? How can I go on living with so much grief? And after a year of being in that kind of state of mourning, he was sitting in meditation one day and he felt his daughter's presence and he realized his name is Joe Coletti, Colletti. So he was sitting in meditation, he felt his daughter's presence, and he realized he'd been asking himself the wrong question. And the wrong question was, what am I going to do with this grief? And the right question that came to him is, what am I going to do with all this love? And when he asked that question, he felt a path come forward that he wanted to live for. And the path was to become a spiritual director or have a master's in divinity and to console and counsel other parents who have lost children. And that's what he's done for these many, many years since. And every holiday time, he gathers parents together in a workshop to help them through the holidays with their loss of their children. He then went on to become a focuser and to become a biospiritual focuser. And is biospiritual focusing something you've touched on in your course? Jeffrey, is that?
Not much, no.
Okay, so just to say a sentence about biospiritual focusing, there were two Catholic priests, Peter Campbell and Edwin McMahon, and they were getting their doctorate together at the University of Toronto in Canada. And they found Gendlin's work and they wanted to connect with him. And so they went to New York to meet with him. And I've heard the story both from Peter Campbell and also from Jean Gendlin. So it's fun that I have, sort of both sides of the story. And they said to Gendlin, so what happens with the felt shift? What exactly is going on, do you think, when there's a felt shift? And Gendlin looked at them and he said, I think that's what you guys would call grace. So they took their brand of focusing, if you will, their branch of focusing, and they spread it throughout the Catholic Church very successfully for many years. And I think they're both deceased now, but they made quite an impact. And Joe Coletti and others are keeping the biospiritual world alive. And there's a wonderful website if you go to biospiritual.com, I think it is. So Joe Coletti thinks a lot about spirituality, and he almost kind of tongue in cheek as a businessman said, I think spirituality is like real estate. He said, it's about location, location, location. And what he means by that is, where do we stand in relation to our lives? Where do we stand in relation to our problems? Where do we stand in relation to our blessings, right? Does that connect to all of you, that there's a way that we can position ourselves, right? And I think it's about perspective. How can we bring perspective to our lives? And so about a year and a half ago, my husband was diagnosed with cancer. And the first few months, we were really in what I call a cancer cave. We were in a state of intense fear and negative imagery and worry about the foreshortened future and so forth. And then after a while, we emerged and we relocated ourselves, both of us each in our own way, to standing in a different way in the face of that illness, to a more spiritual place where we deeply appreciate each other, and we deeply appreciate our lives and our children and our grandchildren in a way that is just more intense and more beautiful. It's the rapture of being alive. So I think you probably all understand what it means to get the right distance from something so that you have perspective. And focusing, of course, is a beautiful way to do that. So let's talk about, how does focusing open us to the spiritual? How is it a doorway to the spiritual? I often ask Jean Gendlin, why don't you name the spiritual? Because Gendlin, called it the big system or the big everything or the greater outdoor thing outside of us, right? But he didn't actually use the word spiritual. And what he told me was, he said, he wanted to always use fresh language. And like Stephanie, that there are people for whom the word spiritual doesn't open it up this experience well, right? So he said, if I use the word spiritual in a workshop, he said, half the people will love it and they'll really get something from that. And the other half will think that we're going to be chanting Om for the next half hour, and they may be turned off. And so I love that about him, that he was so careful in his language. So he didn't want to use a word that had other meanings for people, perhaps. So I want to share with you what some focusers have said about how focusing opens to the spiritual. Let me see if I can find that. I'm sure you've heard this first sentence. There isn't anyone who's studying focusing who hasn't heard this. Jean said, when I use the word body, I mean much more than the physical machine. Your physically felt body is in fact part of a gigantic system of here and other places, now and other times, you and other people. In fact, the whole universe. The sense of being bodily alive in a vast system is the body as it's felt from the inside. How many of you have heard that before or came across it, right? You can't hear that too many times, can you? It's so beautiful. It really captures how focusing can open us onto the spiritual. Campbell and McMahon, these Catholic priests that I mentioned before, defined it this way. They said, focusing seems to bring one closer to a point of spiritual alchemy, whereby body transmutes into soul and soul into body. I'll just take a moment to take that in. Spiritual alchemy, whereby body transmutes into soul and soul into body. So I'd like to hear from you. How do you experience focusing? If you do experience that it opens you to the larger system or the more, how does it do that for you? What is it about focusing that does that?
Inga, go ahead.
Focusing for me has been, getting settled, becoming relaxed, going in, but then with the inward, my awareness doesn't stay inside my body or with my body, it expands to something much greater. So it's kind of an in and then it's an out. And then when I perceive that and want to go with it, then it's like limitless. It's more than just my surroundings or whatever. It just like goes, like into space. It's almost kind of like, the Star Trek episodes when they're going, Starship Enterprise goes into outer space and then takes off like that. That's kind of what happens for me. So that's for me, that feels very spiritual. It feels divine when that's what focusing helps me with.
Beautifully put. It's great.
Riley?
Yes, to both of those things that have been said, flow, expansiveness. I think I'm interested too in like this idea of an unseen order or a sense of invisibility. And part of how I've come to kind of like, focusing is this dialectic, this back and forth between, oh, there's this felt sense and oh, there's these symbols. And I tend to think of those as like an invisible something interacting with a visible something, like a symbol, a form. I give a visible thing, but it's really about interacting with this invisible or unseen order. And it's very strange to me the way that the felt sense is like this access to like a type of orderliness that cannot be made visible, cannot be turned into a picture, cannot be formulated, but is known and felt. And so really this, making the visible or making the invisible visible is part of how I've started to understand this.
Gorgeous. Thank you.
Stefani?
Yeah, for me, it's the attitude that brings for me a very different perspective on me, on life, on difficulties, on hard times. And it gives me, and I can't put it into words and even not spiritual, but it gives me like the capacity to be with that and not to be to judge it and all that stuff, but just to be with it. And so that's great for me.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. I do think that the focusing attitude is an essential piece of the focusing process because it really teaches us to treat ourselves with friendliness, with compassion, with reverence, with care.
Yeah.
And that then what we get when we use that attitude, when we have that attitude, is very different than what we would get if we didn't. Yeah. So we've said that one of the aspects, so focusing has so many aspects, you know, it's as Riley said, it's about making the invisible visible, giving language to what is felt. It's about the attitude. And it's also, I think, one other aspect of focusing, I think, really helps it become a portal. And that is that let's see how to put this. Genlin actually didn't want people to think that focusing was about being with your feelings. And sometimes he would say in workshops to kind of wake people up, focusing is not being with your feelings. And everyone would kind of go, what? And then he would say, it's about turning to another state where we have a feeling of a whole situation. And I think that is such an important focusing question. What's the whole of it, right? And when you ask what's the whole of it, it's an intimation that there's more, and often that there's something very spiritual there. So to give you an example with a client, they come in and they just in terrible grief about the death of their dog, and they're just, you know, in grief. And then if you ask, can you just, what's the whole of this for you, this experience of losing your dog? What you'll often get then is something very different, right? Then there'll be the more will come, not just the sadness, which is a part of it, but the joy that we've had, you know, that person's had with their dog, the adventures they've had, the companionship they've had. You know, it's fuller, it's richer, and it's often more spiritual. So I think that's another, I have never seen that in any other process or practice where we're invited to be with the whole of something. And that's a human feature that Genlin named, that we have that capacity. Animals don't have that. And it's a very special capacity that I think kind of opens the doorway or the portal to the spiritual. But focusing isn't our only portal to the spiritual. So, you know, I wonder what else for you reliably takes you to a place where you're in the presence of the more. You're in the presence of that seamless connection with something larger than you and larger than your life. And, you know, it could be something difficult, you know, a dark night of the soul kind of experience can sometimes bring you there. But also it could be, you know, music. Someone's about to see Taylor Swift. Obviously, you made the trip there in the hopes of having something really open for you in that music experience, right? It could be a praying or chanting or being in any one of the many features of nature. Mountains and oceans and rivers and lakes and meadows and rainbows and thunders. You know, there's so many features of nature that can open us up. Or maybe just beauty or rituals that you engage in. So why don't we each take a moment and write down 3 or 4 doorways or portals that reliably work for us to open to the spiritual, and just see what we find. I'll take a moment, really sense inside. I'm asking, what can I count on that will help me in a hard time or to get to that bigger perspective? And just raise your hand so I know that you've had a chance to do that. Thanks. So let's share with each other some of what came, because often somebody else's portal will suddenly spark a memory that, oh yes, that works for me too. Who wants to start? Jeffrey, you.
I had those down, and the face of the other, which is a kind of, I mean, I guess that's love, but it's there's a being transported by the face of the other.
Oh. And
I was gonna say dance. Yes, dance.
Say more.
doesn't necessarily have to be with other people, but if like you just really hear music and you can feel it in your body and just go with whatever, even if there could be like looking ridiculous, it doesn't matter. It's just like just letting things flow through.
Beautiful. Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned dance, because movement, of course, when we're moving, we are always engaging with the more. I would love to have a wallpaper in my room that had everything that everyone said on it, so that I would remember all of these many portals to not getting stuck in a bad moment, but to always have that possibility. Yeah. So now I would like us to do a little exercise. I hope you all have something to write with or type with or something. So maybe get out a pen and so take a few deep breaths. And for this part, you don't need to write. You're just going to have something come to you and then you'll write it. So see if you can just go inside and find a little quiet inside. And if it works for you to put your hand on your chest to make a deeper connection to yourself, feel free to do that. Let's all just breathe together a little bit. And now I invite you to bring to mind a memory of a pivotal experience that you would call either sacred or spiritual or religious, that had a big impact on you. Maybe it turned your life in a new direction, or maybe it was just deeply memorable. So just take some time to let one such memory come to you of a pivotal experience that you would call spiritual or religious or sacred. And take your time. And just remember, as you're bringing this back, remember what it felt like in your body with all your senses. What could you smell or see? What were you thinking? What was the air like on your skin? And if there are words that capture what was so special or significant or profound about this, let them come to you. And when you're ready, then just open your eyes and write about this experience for a few minutes. And now I'm going to offer another invitation to do a little reflection and then some writing, and then we'll be going into breakout groups to share what you've come to, what's come for you. So this reflection is, I invite you to notice when in your life you tend to feel most deeply alive, or when in your life you feel like you're making the best of your life. And this, you might make a list, or you might just, any way it comes to you. When do you tend to feel most deeply and fully alive? And when do you feel like you're making the best of your life? They may be the same or a little different. And of course, more might come when you share with each other. So in a couple of minutes, you're going to find yourself in a room with 2 other people. And what I suggest you do is somebody do the timing, and each person gets 3 minutes for the first round of the first question, what you'd like to say. And then for round 2 would be the second question, and 2 minutes for that. So you'll each have 5 minutes to speak, and there'll be an extra couple minutes to spare. So we'll be in the room for 17 minutes. Anyone have a question before we go to the rooms? I'd like to hear from a couple of people about something that happened for you. Not so much the content of what you said or what other people said, but what was it like to have this conversation, to talk on this level? What was that like for you? Anyone want to just share before we move on? If not, we'll. Yes, Bridget?
Yeah, so one was this sense of like just really connecting to what other people are saying and feeling it in my body and remembering similar experiences that I've had. So it was this yeah, just this real palpable sense of connection.
Yes, I can relate to other people have that same sense that we were touching into something that was shared, even though we had different entry points to it.
Yeah.
So let's move on and talk about how can we bring this spiritual dimension into our work? How can we do that more? And I want to say that the first way that I like to do that is when I first meet a client, I want to let them know that this dimension is okay to talk about, because a lot of people feel like I have to park my religion or park my spirituality over there, and this is for psychology or my mental health or whatever. And of course, they're all interconnected. And so, you know, we want to, when we first meet someone, and sometimes I'll say, if I know someone has a religious background, like they were raised Catholic or Jewish or Hindi, or I'll say, what has your religious been a positive factor for you, a negative factor, or neutral? Right? Just to open up the conversation, like to say, it's fine to talk about that here, right? And then I'll also ask for, you know, if I'm doing an intake, meeting someone for the first time and getting their history, I'll ask them to tell me about a very difficult time in their lives and what psychological and spiritual resources help them at that time. And by doing that, I get more information about what their spiritual and psychological resources are that we can call on in our work together, right? So I think just naming the spiritual or the sacred or the religious and bringing it in right away in the beginning as, you know, this is fine to talk about this is important. I think the second thing is something you already know how to do, which is to bring in the focusing and the clearing of space into your, whether you do it in mini focusing moments or whether you actually take the time to do a whole focusing process. You know, that's certainly some way to open to the spiritual, to the more, to the whole of it, right? And then I think I talked in my paper that I think some of you read about ways to listen for the spiritual that's not named as such, right? You know, to really hear the implicit. If someone says they're miserable in their job, you know, that's already telling you that there's not a fit there for them. And so to ask them what would be a job that was filled your soul or brought you joy, or, you know, so to use language that helps them get there. A third thing is to always notice when someone brings in the positive, because the positive is a very powerful doorway to the spiritual. And, you know, we all have a negativity bias that we're, you know, it's built into our brain that we take in the negative and it goes right to long-term memory, whereas the positive is more like, it just slips off us and evanescent. And so when anyone mentions something positive, I try and stay with it for a few moments to see if the more that can come from that. You know, so if someone says, I had a wonderful time with my daughter this morning before I took her to school, but then all hell broke loose. Before we get to the all hell broke loose, I want to go back to what was the quality of those moments with your daughter? What made it so joyful, so special, right? Because that's a resource that we then bring when we're talking about the hell breaking loose, right? So it's really important to stay with the positive and to notice it. It can be so quick because people kind of just go right by it. They think they're not there to talk about the good things. They're only there to talk about their problems. So you have to really catch it quickly when someone says, oh, what a gorgeous day today is. I stay right there with that. What does it feel like in your body to have a day like today? Right. So to do that. And then one other thing that I didn't get to mention in the paper, but which has been occurring to me, is the use of rituals in therapy, or to have people come up with rituals when they're going through transitions, because rituals are kind of a way to get across a threshold when you're moving from one place to another. And so I sometimes ask people either what ritual from their own tradition would be useful here, or whether they have an idea of something they would like to do to help them come into this new territory of parenting, or of retiring, or of a divorce, or of starting out as a single person after having been partnered. Any of those. So I'll tell you about one ritual that I came up with my client. Essentially she came up with it and I was just supporting her. And she was about to have surgery for breast cancer, and she was very apprehensive about it. And I asked her whether she thought it might be helpful if the day before the surgery, she could have a gathering of some close friends. And she just perked up immediately. She hadn't thought of it, but it really resonated to her. And so I asked her to help to design what would be the perfect kind of ceremony or gathering for her. And she said, well, it would have to start with my favorite music. And I want everyone just to be silent as we listen to this music together. I said, okay, and then what's going to come next? And she said, well, next, I think I want everyone to take a turn in the circle and to tell me how they faced the hardest thing they've ever faced. They don't even need to tell me what it was, but I want to know what resources they brought to the hardest thing they'd ever faced, because this is the hardest thing I've ever faced, right? And then I said, okay, so then you gather all of these resources, and then what, is that enough, or does something come to next? And she said, I would like each person to find 1 or 2 words that they think is the essence of who I am. And she did that. And then I said, okay, and will that be the end of the ceremony? She said, almost, but then I think I want to lie down and have everybody touch a different part of me, a shoulder, a foot, a hand, an arm, and I'd like them to sing to me. So she had this, beautiful, it turned out to be 90-minute ceremony that she gave herself as a ritual before going to the surgery. And I think she felt that made a huge difference for her, that she was going in, she felt strengthened, she felt supported, she felt connected to something larger than herself. She felt that everybody's hardest thing was with her when she went into her hardest thing, and she could bring all their resources with her. And she felt loved, she felt seen. She said, I felt gotten. I felt like they got who I am, right? So just an idea of, sometimes we really need not just talking to our therapist, but we need to enact something in our lives to help us get through, very difficult times. I want to open it up and see how do you bring the spiritual into whatever work you're doing? Let's learn from each other and inspire each other.
Well, I think it's just finding, as you were talking, Joan, about when someone begins to touch something in this area, to just notice and kind of bring that out. Like, oh, here's something, and can we find some words for it? And can you say more about it?
Mm-hmm. So I wish we had more time. I'm sure you all have many ideas, but I actually want to close with a little exercise before we part today. And the exercise is, you have been together for 2 years, and I believe that this training is coming to an end. Am I right about that, Jeffrey?
Shortly.
What?
Shortly.
Shortly. So I wonder if you could each take a moment to pause and go inside and ask yourself, what's been a highlight, or what's been meaningful, or what's been important or profound about this time together? And just take a moment to really see, again, what your body knows that you might not yet have words for. Just see what's true for you in this moment, And just when you're ready, if you want to share, no need to share, just get it for yourself. Get it for yourself. But if you would like to share, we have another just a couple of minutes, and I'd love to hear from some people.
Can I share?
Please.
I'm touched or moved by, I'm thinking about Jeffrey dedicating his life to sharing this work. And I'm thinking about the undertaking of sharing the work of focusing with somebody who doesn't know what it is, really. You guys are a little frozen. I'll wait just a second. But just, I'll say just the trust that a teacher must have that people will find their way to this special current of knowing, and the patience that a teacher must have, and like holding the space for that, and having people just, at least for me, just fluttering all over the place, flying in, flying out, wondering what this is, blah, blah, blah. And then really landing in on that branch with everybody just feels really good.
What a beautiful image, landing on the branch with everybody. So yes, honoring Jeffrey as this trusting, patient, incredibly competent, devoted teacher.
Yes.
I think we have in common all that we're fans of Jeffrey.
Well, and part of that is a debt and a gratitude to you, Joan.
Oh. So just to review today, I tried to cover something about the spiritual dimension being intrinsic to being a human being, and that it can sustain us in times of suffering, in times of stress, and it can give great meaning to our lives. And it's a felt experience. It's not an intellectual one. And I think it's one of the cornerstones of what it means to be human. So it has been such a pleasure to get to talk about what I'm most passionate about with other people who share that. It's just been very special. And I'm grateful to Jeffrey for the invitation to be with you today.